I wasn't going to do more games, but Raoul wants me to do some more games, so I'm going to give you a couple more games to do. The game we've just done is illustrating planning. Yep, so that's one particular brain skill. Oh, we're having a conversation here with different brain scans. Do you want to... I don't want people to miss out on talking, but also not to miss out on games. We have a long lunch. Okay, great. So the game Raoul wanted us to demonstrate to you is a different brain skill, and I'm going to make you do a little test with me. Can you all see the screen all right? Okay. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to show you on the screen words printed on the screen. Okay. Raoul's done this one, so he's not going to do it again. And I'm going to show you two columns. And I want all of you out loud just to read the words with me as quickly as you can. Okay? Are you ready to try? Raoul, are you okay with us doing it without you? All right. Okay. So let's do it. Okay? And go. Okay, that wasn't very good. You have to do it together at the same time, like a choir. Okay? Ready? Go. Okay, that's all right. Do you think you can do it even faster? Okay, and go. Together. You're not coordinated. You're not coordinated. Everyone together. And go. Excellent. That was good. Okay. Now we're going to do it again. But this time, instead of reading the word, I want you to say the color that the word was printed in. Okay? Do you know what you're going to do? Not the word, the color. As quickly as you can. Also in English, not in Hindi. I know that. Okay? Might be easier actually in Hindi. Right? Are you ready? As fast as you can as a group. And go. No, that wasn't so good. Why was that? What did that feel like? Why was that harder? This one is not used the word conditioning. She said dual tasking. It's neither dual tasking nor conditioning. It is what we call response inhibition. So to this, for the psychologist, where is our psychologist? Is she outside? Maybe. Yeah, let's just make sure that she comes, because she might not. She's missing out on the fun here. So there's a specific brain skill called response inhibition, and so this task that we've done is called a Strop task. For those of you who might know, S-T-R-O-O-P, Strop, because what it means is the conditioning you're talking about is reading becomes automatic in our brains. And what we have to do here, we have to stop something that's automatic and replace it with something else. So every time you see the word red, you need to say to yourself, don't read, say the color. Don't read, say the color. So that's response inhibition. And inhibiting responses for people with TSC is very difficult for many people. Things just come out. It just blurted out. And often afterwards, we might realize, oh, I shouldn't have done that. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. But it's happened already. But in the same way that we can practice things to become automatic like reading, we can therefore, when we want to do an intervention, we can practice something else to become automatic rather than the difficult behavior too. So it helps us understand that. Let me make you do one more game. And that is to illustrate the concept of working memory. So working memory, another name that people use for that is short-term memory. But short-term memory doesn't mean what you did for breakfast. Working memory or short-term memory is all of us have a little bit of memory that we hold in our brains while we're doing things. So like if I give you my phone number and I say 234596, you kind of hear it in your head, right? Until you write it down and then it goes. Okay. And all of us have a working memory span that has a limited capacity. Both in, we can hear things and we can see things. So like if I show Shoba a picture and she closes her eyes, she can sort of see the picture in her mind's eye for a few seconds, then it goes away. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make you test your own working memory and see what is your capacity. Okay, I know we do it in English, so it's harder in a different language, but let's practice. What I'm going to do, I'm going to say some numbers, and then I want you just to repeat the numbers after I've said them, okay? We might have some competition. All right. So here comes the first. Don't write them down. That'll be cheating. Just hear them and then say them after when I say. Okay? Here comes the first set, right? 4, 7, 9. Okay? Say them. Okay? Here comes the next ones. 2, 6, 8, 5, 4. Okay? Okay. Here comes the next one. 1, 7, 3, 2, 5, 7, 3, 8, 2, 5. Okay? Okay. So I heard some of you started to kind of get a little bit giggly at the end. Why? What happened? What happened to the numbers? Okay. So what happens to most people is when you get to the limit of your capacity, it tends to feel as though it disappears. It wipes it. And you might remember one thing or you might remember another, but most people, it's like it's gone away. And that's how working memory and working memory capacity works. For most typical people, we have a working memory, a span, that's what I was testing, of about 5 to 7 units. So the middle one was a 5, so you all did, that was pretty easy. And the third one, I gave you 10, so I deliberately pushed it. And most people would not be able to do 10. So that's why I pushed it. But imagine in TSC, many kids and many people might have a memory span of only 2 or 3. So if you say to your child, go to your bedroom and look in the top drawer, and if you see your shoes, bring them. Can you see I've already given you too many things? So they might go to the room, they might remember, I need to go to my room, but not remember, what am I supposed to do? And then they're in the room, and then they might see something else that looks much more interesting. And then before you know it, they're doing something different. And then we're at risk of saying, you naughty child, you should have done that. But maybe we overwhelm their brain's capacity in terms of their working memory. Can we improve working memory? Yes. There are lots of ways you can build that number. There are computer games people do that lights flash up and you need to press them in the same order, or there's even an international competition of people doing working memory to see who can have the longest list of numbers they can remember. The champions can do like 100 numbers or more. I can do maybe 7 or 8. I don't think I could do 10. But we can practice it. So all these are brain skills we can practice. But it's nice to feel what it feels like when it just wipes out of your mind, or when you really can't stop it. I think that's why you were keen for us just to illustrate it in a way, because these are the real-life challenges of so many people with TSC. And that's why we say, and back to the conversation I heard about people saying, my doctor doesn't want to prescribe this, my doctor doesn't want to do this. That's why we have international guidelines, because the guidelines were drawn up by international experts, and so we knew that that would give power to families, because you can say, this is what the international guidelines suggest. Can we please have you think about that with us? That's why guidelines are there. They're not laws, but they're really trying to encourage people to have shared practice. And we have guidelines about epilepsy and about brain surgery and about kidneys and about TAND. And so the TAND guidelines say at least every year, everybody with TS should be screened for TAND, because we know it can change and because we know most people will have some issues. And then once you've screened and you've picked up something that looks problematic, you should do more detailed evaluations, whatever that might be, to try and understand that difficulty. And people said to us, that's fine, you understand all the TAND stuff, but we don't. Can you give us a tool that will help us make it easier? And that's the reason we then developed this thing called the TAND checklist. And I'll hand out a copy to each of you. And so it's exactly the structure of all the things we've just talked through. And it's just written in a way that can help you have a conversation with your doctor, with a psychologist, with the clinic nurse, with the dermatologist, with anybody around all these bits of TAND. And they're simple questions, yes, no, mostly. And then at the end, we say, which of these things are you worried about? And let's come up with a plan. So it really is just to help people talk about TAND. And Lauren, as you've seen, as I said, has done some pilot validation of it. So we made sure that it looks right. And it does the job that it needs to do. And the papers, if any of you are interested, are available on the internet. So we deliberately publish them in a way that you don't need to pay to read them. They're open. Because we realize for many people, particularly families, you can't pay $30 for everything you want to download. So that's why we made it free. And in fact, Lauren made me do a little movie. So there's an online movie as well where I interview a mum in Cape Town with a 6-year-old daughter with TSC, just to illustrate how you can use the TAND checklist. So you can watch it or tell other people to go and look at it as well. And that's then also why we started to translate the TAND checklist into many, many different languages. We're on about number 15, language number 15 now. We did a number in the last year as well. In fact, most of these are now finished. And I was just talking to Shoba beforehand about the possibility that you might want to consider translating it into some Southeast Asian languages like Hindi and others as well. And TAND checklist, so this is the email address for Max, who's the TAND checklist coordinator, Shoba. Shoba will be the boss on this one because we want it to be a coordinated effort. So we'd be very happy to talk to you and to email you about that if you want to do it. The reason for that is many people can access English or another language, but it's so much more powerful in your own language to be able to communicate your child's or your own needs. And apart from screening, because screening is just a quick check, screening is not the detail. Apart from screening, we then also say different developmental stages bring different challenges. When you're in your first 3 years of life, you have different issues to when you're a teenager. So in each of these life phases, you should have a comprehensive assessment, by which we mean somebody should think about all those bits of the umbrella. Welcome back. You missed out on the games. And so across all those levels of the umbrella, when you're in infancy, because we want to know what early developmental issues might there be autism, intellectual disability, those sorts of things. Then in the preschool years, to make sure we know what you will need in school. In some countries like here, that's very similar, because if you start to go to school at 3.5 or 4, that's sort of the same thing. The goal is to understand the developmental profile and then to plan what's next. And then in primary years, we want kids to be reassessed, because that's when all the school difficulties and sometimes ADHD and some other things start to present. They may not be there before, and then they start to become clear. And then in high school in particular, all the other mental health issues. Sometimes autistic things become more prominent in secondary school, particularly in girls, but many academic things, many peer relationship things, the anxiety, the depression, that's often when they start to present. And we also want to think, what might they need after school? Because in most countries of the world, I've been in many, no country has good systems and services for people once they leave school. So once you're after 18, it's hard for people wherever they are. And that's why we said, we want you to think about transition to adult life. And then in that early, the first few years after school, between 18 and 25, we want people also to be checked in to say what will they need for as independent living as possible. As you know, many people with TSC live completely independently, many are very dependent, many are somewhere in between. So it's about finding what your family members' needs might be. You said you want to know the future for your daughter. We cannot read the future, unfortunately. But what we can do is to know what she's at risk of, to look for it as early as we can, to catch it as early as we can, because the earlier we can catch some of these things, the more we can prevent secondary problems. You know, once a child, let's take academic difficulties, once a child struggles in school with maths, then they start to feel bad about going to school, then they might not want to go to school, they might get aggressive in school, they might get aggressive with you because you want to drag them into school. You can say those are all the secondary deficits of that problem. So we want to try and catch it as early as we can. For each of those things, we can do things to make it better. So those are the guidelines in the international guidelines for TSC. And then the third thing we say is, always remember TSC is a biological condition. And let's not, now that we get your attention for TAND, let's not say everything is TAND. Because if there's a sudden change, if your child is calm and lovely and pleasant and suddenly becomes aggressive, or suddenly starts to have sleep problems, or suddenly withdraws and is no longer interested in things, that might be a sign of something physical going on. And it could be a sign maybe of being ill. It could be a sign of seizures changing. It could be a sign of the SAGA growing in their brain. It could be a sign of the kidneys getting infected or having kidney failure. So if there's sudden change, we need to think about it as a physical condition and think brain, kidneys, other organs, medications. It's important to remember that the medications we give to make our family members better can actually make them worse. Even some of the seizure medications can cause irritability, not being able to focus, not being able to concentrate. So it's that balance that we need to keep in mind. And don't forget, SAGAs, those giant cell astrocytomas, can lead to lots and lots of TAND-related manifestations. I'll give you one example. We had a boy, and I often use this example because it was just so striking. 15-year-old boy, he was in a mainstream school, never had any major difficulties. And suddenly, at the age of 15, he started to become super aggressive to his friends, to the teachers. He was just irritable and restless. And in fact, they wanted to kick him out of school because he'd just changed so much. School said he's just a naughty teenager. And mum and dad said, he has tuberous sclerosis. Could it be something else? And they brought him to the clinic, and we did a brain scan, and he had a big SAGA that was growing. And we know that these behavioral manifestations can be signs of SAGAs growing. And so he had surgery, that was in the days before medications, surgery for his SAGA, and within a number of months he was back in school. And he was back to the old child, not the aggressive one. So you can see, mums and dads and grannies and grandpas know their family members best. You will know if this feels different from usual. And those are the clues to perhaps thinking physical stuff as well. So let me just say a few words about TAND research, and then we'll look at the TAND checklist. Fortunately, there's growing research in TAND. There didn't used to be. It used to be only me and a woman called Anne Hunt, who was my mentor in the UK, but now there are many more people doing it. But I'm just going to give you two examples. The first is, and this is an area that we're currently working on, can we find natural clusters of TAND manifestations? And I'll tell you more about that. And can we use mTOR inhibitors, everolimus, afinitor, the drugs we're talking about for the kidney and the brain and the skin, can they also improve TAND? So I'm just going to say two words about each of those. So the cluster issue. As you will know, and as we've said already, every person with TSC have their own profile. And so what we're saying to people at the moment is each person has a unique set of TAND difficulties, and that's what you need to evaluate, and that's what you need to treat. Now, on the one hand, that's right, and that's true, because all of us are unique. On the other hand, that made it very difficult for doctors and even for families and for people to say, well, if it's so unique, it's actually a little bit overwhelming. Is there a way for us to make it a little bit more simple? And so what Lauren Leclésio, who I introduced you to, and I wanted to do, was we knew from some other conditions that these days we have fancy computer programs that can see if there's natural grouping of things. So the umbrella I showed you is the way that we as scientists group things. But we wanted to ask a question, could we, if we just take hundreds of people with TSC and we got them to fill in a TAND checklist and we then put it into a computer, can the computer find groups that we maybe can't see with our eyes? Because if we can, then maybe that will help us to say there are these groups of difficulties to look for, to identify, to treat, and so on. And our ideal was if we could find, it sounds like a joke, but it's kind of how we thought if we could find fewer than 10 groups of things, most doctors can count to 10. And so that feels a bit more manageable than anything possible. And so I'm not going to show you any detail here, but basically what Lauren did was firstly in a small group of people and then in a group of just over 500 people with TSC around the world, we gave them the checklist, we put the data in, and what she found was we were able to find in TSC 7 natural groups of TAND manifestations. And so I think it sounds much more manageable for us to say, so we as doctors and as families should look for 7 groups of difficulties. They're the things that you know about, they just group together. And for each of those groups, we then need to think, so what's the evidence? What are the possible treatments? What are the next steps? And we'll talk a bit about those after lunch. And so here are the groups. We didn't tell the computer what the groups should be, so it's completely based on natural presentations. But you can see, and I was very pleased to see, that the first natural group we saw was the group of reading, writing, spelling, math, so the academic difficulties. A very clear, very specific group that's separate from all the other groups. Isn't that interesting? The second main group we saw was the group of overactivity, restlessness, impulsivity. So that kind of overactive, impulsive group. Sometimes we see it with other things, but it presents on its own as well. Then we saw a big group, separate group for mood, anxiety, depression, shyness, the kind of mood group of symptoms. We saw a separate group here, all the kind of stuff, games that we've just done. Attention difficulties, visuospatial difficulties, memory difficulties, that's the neuropsychological group. We saw a separate group for aggression and temper tantrums, so the kind of dysregulated behaviors. It talks to many others, you can see it's quite close to the others. We saw a separate group for eating and sleeping, because many people with TC have eating, sleeping difficulties. And then we had this very big group. The orange one is kind of, you can see it overlaps with lots of others, is the autism spectrum related group. So what it tells us is many people have ASD things, but they also often come with other things in some of the other TAND clusters. So these are the 7 clusters. And what we're now starting to do is to say to people, let's think how we look for the cluster. Yeah.
The behavior circle, oval, what we call, is much smaller. Is that indicative of that the behavior problems are lesser? Or
No.
is it the design?
It's just how we just used weightings based on the computer algorithms to show the size and the distribution. So it doesn't mean it's less of a problem. It's not how often is it a problem in different individuals, because we know it's very common. Yeah. So when we come back, in fact, particularly after lunch, I will show you how on the TAND checklist we find these clusters and then how we can think about what we do about each of those. But I thought that was interesting. So what we now want to do is to say to people, look for these 7 natural clusters and let's think what we can do about these 7 natural clusters. Because what we want, and this was Lauren's dream project, Lauren wanted us to find clusters and then find a way of using the clusters to give next step interventions and tools to families. Exactly the kind of stuff that you are talking about. And in fact, her fantasy, her vision was that we should try to put the checklist on an app, and then once you filled in the app, it automatically gives you your clusters, and then when you click on the cluster, it automatically takes you to what you can do next. I think that's pretty visionary. That was Lauren's vision, and Shoba knows that we've submitted some grants to try and get money to try and do that. We will hear at the end of this month if we have money. If we don't have the money, we're going to find somebody to give us the money so that we can do it, because I think that's a really powerful and important project for us to do. Exactly because mums and dads are the people who have the greatest power to work with their family members. Not because we want to turn you into therapists, but because you live with your family members anyway, at least most of the time. So that's the story. The second big research question that we have at the moment is, can we use these medications, the mTOR inhibitors, to treat TAND? Now, you might ask, why do we even ask the question? Does anybody know this picture? Are any of you experts in the intracellular signaling of tuberous sclerosis? Okay, do you want a 2-minute lesson in how intracellular signaling works? Okay, let me do it. This is intracellular signaling for psychiatrists. Inside every cell of our body, we have lots and lots of proteins, and they talk to one another. So they send messages. And so if you imagine that all these numbers are different proteins, and they're all inside the cells of your body, right? And so if this is the outside of the cell, we know about, you've all heard about receptors, and we give lots of drugs in psychiatry that treats the receptors, but we don't actually know what happens inside. In tuberous sclerosis, we actually know what happens inside every cell of our body when it has or doesn't have TSC. And here you can see the TSC1 and the TSC2 proteins. So all of us, whether we have TSC or not, have all these proteins. And here they are, and they form a complex. And what they do, if you see an arrow, it means that that protein, that guy, when it talks to this one, it activates him. Yeah, like it wakes him up. And when you see a flat thing, it means if that protein talks to the other one, it inhibits it, it stops it, it puts the brakes on it. And the balance inside our cells is a balance between activating and inhibiting, of stimulating and stopping. Yeah? And here you can see the TSC proteins are right in the center of many of these processes in our cells, and they put the brakes on this protein called mTOR, the mammalian target of rapamycin. And mTOR is one of those proteins that does many jobs, but some of the key jobs it does is it makes cells grow inside our body. And so when we have TSC, and this thing can no longer put the brakes on, it means there's too much of this guy. So what then happens? Cells grow too much. In the brain, on the skin, in the kidneys, wherever. Too much cell growth. And so the amazing thing for us in tuberous sclerosis is, not many years ago, we discovered that the proteins sit there above mTOR. It was only in 2002, 2003 that this discovery was made. That's recent. And when that discovery was made, people said, do you know what? There's a drug that's already on the market called rapamycin. And rapamycin inhibits this guy. And you remember I've just said, this is the guy that goes crazy in TSC. So people said, and we said, so what will happen if we use this drug in people with TSC? Might it dampen it down and stop some of that growth? And as you know, a decade later, that's exactly what we found. Firstly in the brain study, then in the kidney study, now even in the epilepsy story, because we know all this dysregulates all sorts of things. Back to TAND. The TSC proteins talk to mTOR, but you can see they're also surrounded by lots of other proteins. And many of these proteins are involved in lots of brain processes. Some of you might have heard of long-term potentiation, synaptic plasticity, neural plasticity, those kind of words. So the guys in blue are all involved in making and keep forming memories, for instance. Yeah? The guys in green are involved in myelination. Myelination is making the white matter inside our brains and the sheaths around the nerve cells. So they're like the highways. And the better they form, the faster messages can get across in the brain. And the less they form, the slower messages go, or the more they can get confused. These guys are involved in the actin cytoskeleton. That's in the brain. It's like the scaffolding for how the brain cells grow. And if the scaffolding doesn't work well, the brain cells go all over the place, and messages can get all confused. So you can see that's why when we realized this, we said, well, given that all these proteins might be disrupted in TSC, maybe if we give rapamycin, it will not only improve the physical stuff, but it might improve some of the brain and mental health things too. We were talking earlier about anxiety. People were very interested. Did you know that there are animal models for tuberous sclerosis? So there's a TSC1 and a TSC2 mouse. And there's a rat that has tuberous sclerosis. Did you know that? Called the Ika rat. Some people knew that. And so in anxiety, many people used to say, well, it's understandable that people with TSC have anxiety because it's a tough life and you don't know what's going to happen, and it's, all those psychological interpretations. But interestingly, we can test anxiety in animals as well. And when people looked at anxiety in the TSC mice and in the TSC rat, they saw that animals with TSC have more anxiety than animals without TSC. Isn't that amazing? So it's not just the psychological impact. There's something about the biology of TSC that influences many of the TAND manifestations. And same with autism. Mice, did you know mice can have autism or autistic-like things and so on? And so we saw also that mice with TSC have more social difficulties than mice without TSC. And the amazing thing, and that's when people got really excited, was when we then started to give rapamycin or everolimus or these kind of medications to the mice with TSC, their social difficulties went away, and their memory problems went away, and their anxiety got less. So that's what got people very excited. And so we've been doing a few studies, small scale, a little bit bigger now, to see can we use these medications to improve not just the physical stuff, but TAND. A number of studies are going on. I'm just going to mention two. We did a study in Boston and Cincinnati. Some of you have met Darcy Kruger when he was here last time, so Darcy was part of the team. We looked at young people, 6 to 21 with TSC. We gave them the medications for 6 months. The answer of that study was actually the results were mixed. That's the best way to summarize it. Some people got better, some got worse, some stayed the same. Well, actually, nobody got worse. And I think in part it was because we were still trying to figure out how to do this kind of research, because all of us started a different place with TSC, and it's difficult to do this sort of study. The second thing we did, we then looked at older people in the UK. They all had TSC, they all had to have a high enough IQ so that they could do all the different tests and games that we wanted them to do, and we gave them the medication for 6 months. And we found two things, and I thought both of them were very interesting. The first thing we found was that even the people who were given placebo, in other words, the sugar pill, about 40% of them got better as we retested their TAND manifestations. Now, the way I interpret that is that in itself is evidence that for most of us, when we are in a novel situation, that novelty is in itself overwhelming. Imagine you take your son or daughter for the first time for an assessment with a psychologist or a neuroscientist. That's overwhelming. It's novel, it's anxiety-provoking, you don't quite know. Just the familiarity of knowing what to expect, being familiar with what's going to happen, the room, the people, can help you learn better. So I don't think that's a negative thing. I think that's an incredibly powerful message for all of us. Why we say, make it predictable, make it the same, make it understandable, because it improves learning, and we have evidence for that. But interestingly, the people who had the everolimus, the mTOR inhibitor, more than 70% of them improved in the memory and the tasks that we gave them. So over and above the kind of learning effect, there did seem to be a signal of the medications also improving some of their TAND profile. Now that's a small study that we did, 25 and 25 people, or in fact about 40 in the study. So that doesn't mean that you should now rush out and ask your doctor to prescribe it for your memory or for your child. But what it tells us is I think we have enough to try and do a larger study to ask these questions in more details. At least, if nothing else, it tells us that if you have to use it for kidneys or SAGA or epilepsy, it's also likely to have positive effects on anxiety and on social communication and attention, etc. And if that's true, I think that would be a very fundamental benefit for people who have to take medications like this for TSC. So those are the kind of key things that I wanted us to do, why we coined some of the TAND research. We will now take however many minutes we have. Do we have 5 minutes? Can we take 5 minutes or so before lunch or something? And then when we come back, in fact, if you want us to stop now, we could pause now as well. You can decide. Let's take 5 minutes. I'm just going to show you the TAND checklist, and then we can have lunch. After lunch, we'll come back and think, how can we use the TAND checklist to think about those clusters and to think about treatments or interventions for difficulties in those clusters. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's move on to those. I'm just going to hand out, in fact, if somebody can help me, just hand out a copy to each person. These are still in English, unfortunately. We haven't got to the Hindi one yet. So I'm going to just talk you through it just very briefly. I'm sure there's enough for every person. Good. Is there one, even one for me?
Yes, please take it down.
Just to illustrate. I should know what's in it, but... And of course, I'm not the one who invented it. It was a team of people. So I was just the one who chivvied everyone along to do it. So here's the TAND checklist. And you will see, I'm just going to walk you through the 2 pages. We wanted it to be on one piece of paper, because we knew the moment it's more than one piece of paper, it's going to get lost. Secondly, we wanted to be one thing for anybody of any age and any level of ability. Because otherwise, particularly those of you who work in mental health and psychology will know, you need to have a preschool version and a school-age version and a teenage version and an adult version, and then nobody has the right version in the end. So very, very simple. It's a checklist, not a questionnaire. So what that means is it's really just there as a kind of a tool for us to have a conversation. It doesn't have, you count it up, and if you score more than something, there's a problem. If there's any box that you tick, there may be a problem. So that's the difference between a checklist and a questionnaire. And you'll see it starts, and the idea is that it should be a conversation between the doctor or the clinician and the family. And it just starts saying, most people have TAND difficulties, it's different for different people. So what we're going to do is to ask you about your child or your family member. Some might be relevant, some might not be relevant at all. Just answer them so that we can build up that picture. And then you'll see the first section, number 1, is about milestones. Now, if your son or daughter is 38, it might be hard to remember those milestones. But if your daughter is 3 or 4, it shouldn't be so difficult. So the idea also is, if it happens over time, we also have a record of some of these milestones. Milestones are useful because it gives us a sense of early red flags for developmental difficulties. That's why we're particularly interested in those. We'll talk a bit more about those. Then item 2 is just about getting a broad sense of their functioning. It's very, we're going to think differently when somebody has language or don't have language, when they're mobile, when they're not mobile, etc. So that's just our sense of who we are talking about, because often we might do a screening before I've met the child or the person. Item 3, can you see what item 3 is? It's that behavioral level with all the most common behavioral difficulties that we see in TSC. And we just say, has it been a problem? Yes, no. And we just try and keep it simple so that it just gives us a way. You can, as the clinician, you can talk more about it once somebody says yes. But it's just about having the thought to think about that particular thing. Oh, here we have an athlete. And the big spoon. I think she's going to dish up the food for us. Hello? Hello? Boo. Item number 4. What is item number 4 trying to capture? The common psychiatric difficulties. Autism, ADHD, anxiety, depression, and other kinds of things. So that's just asking, have you ever had a diagnosis of these things? Item 5, the intellectual level. Has your child had an intellectual assessment? What was the score? What do you think? Because, and the reason we ask formal assessment and your impression is because sometimes, well, it's not uncommon, the parents would say, well, he or she scored like this, but I don't think that that represents them, either in the one direction or the other. And we want to understand that because we need to understand, why do you think this is different from what the psychologist's assessment said? That in itself is a conversation to understand. Item 6, academic. So that's the scholastic reading, writing, spelling, maths. Yeah? Most common one to tick is the maths, but any one of them might be a clue. Item 7, most people have difficulties with specific brain skills. That's the neuropsychological. Attention, memory, just to make people think about them as separate difficulties. And you can see for each of them we say, have you ever had assessment for it? If not, would you like to have assessment for it? Just to make people think about, well, let's pursue this in more detail. Item 8, this is now the psychosocial, right? Apart from these things, it has a big impact on people's lives in other ways. Have you had difficulties with self-esteem, stress in the family, stress between parents? Why do we specifically put stress between parents? Because it's very common. Yeah? TSC, particularly when when kids have intellectual disability, particularly when they also have autism or communication difficulties, the combination of these things has a massive burden on families. It has, autism has of all disabilities the greatest burden on families. And so it is a feature of TSC to have marital stress and difficulties. It's not a sign that one family or that you are having weakness as a husband and wife or as a couple or as a family. It's the rule rather than the exception. And we wanted to make that very clear to people. And very often when we ask people, particularly when we ask dads, about family stress, he's having another seizure. Yeah, so this is his third one this morning. Yeah, yeah. And he has, but many people with TSC have many different seizure types. I think he has different seizure types. I think we've seen different ones already this morning. Yeah. And so that's why we want to make sure that we capture and we think about everyone in the family with family stress, particularly the dads who often don't come or who often don't talk about the impact that TSC has on them. And then we ask a general summary. We ask people to prioritize of all these things, what's most important to you, because that's what we're going to work on. It may be that I've asked Shoba all these things and then Shoba will say, do you know what? You haven't asked me about toilet. That's what I want to focus on. Then that's what we should do. We might think about other things too, but that's why we need to, it's about bringing it to an agreement with families about what their priorities are. And then we ask the clinicians to give a rating. Also because if you say something is a 3 out of 10, but I think, gosh, it's much more severe, then that in itself means that there's something to talk about. Or if you say things are a 10 and we don't see it, then it means we need to understand what causes you the stress and the distress that I don't see yet. So that's the TAND checklist. You can see it's very simple. It's not rocket science or complicated, but it's based on the profile and the needs of people with TSC across those very simple levels. I'm going to suggest maybe if somebody has any specific questions that you want to ask either about TAND or about the TAND checklist, that we do that, and then let's pause for some lunch. Because I can see everyone needs a little bit of lunch. Sure, here comes the question for the camera.
Yeah, the third where we are talking about the behavioral things. Sleep difficulties.
Yeah.
It says such as falling asleep or waking. Does it include insomnia also?
Yeah, any sleep difficulties. So if we could do a whole 4-page questionnaire just on sleep.
Yeah.
because many people with TSC have sleep difficulties. Some is about, those are just examples. So you might say, no, he's fine with falling asleep, but actually he wakes in the middle of the night and then he can't sleep again, or she wakes in the middle of the night and then she's very anxious and then she wants to get in bed with me. So there's a huge range of possibilities. So children and people with TSC have huge range. In fact, and the pattern of sleep is, in the first few years of life, we see lots of sleep difficulties, then it tends to be a little bit less. And then actually, as people get older and into adulthood, it gets more again. So we see more in adults as well. Yeah. So any of those, it's really just a marker, because it may be that you said, you know what, I haven't thought about it, but sleep is the biggest thing. Let's think what we can do about sleep. The problem with sleep is when a child with TSC doesn't sleep, it means mum and dad don't sleep either, right? And often the whole house doesn't sleep. So that's the problem. Sleep is, and sleep has a big impact also on learning and on behaviors the next day and all sorts of things. Okay, good? Raul, you had another question, or was it a comment?
Priorities and the profile, I'm assuming, are going to change with time. I mean, that's, she's growing.
Yeah.
So do your natural, the clusters which you've identified, do they also change with age?
Ooh, good question. Yes, priorities and profiles change with time. That's why we say to people at least once a year. The main reason we say at least once a year is because very often in a young child, people might say, no, I have no worries. And then people say, oh, you don't have to come back until you have a worry. So we want to say to people, there might not be a problem now, but next year there may be. Or there might be a problem now, next year it might have gone away, or we might have figured it out. When we did the cluster analysis, we only took a cross-sectional cohort of people. Your question is very interesting to say, do cluster profiles change over time? So for that, it would be a longitudinal study. We'd need to see how people go over time, because it may be that certain of those boxes get bigger or smaller at different ages. Exactly, yeah. So all of those are things that, now that we have the clusters, hey, are you going to sing again? She's singing. All of those are things that the easier we can collect data, like through an app, the more dynamic we can do those kinds of studies as well. Yeah, so good question. There's another one.
I'm sorry, I was a little in and out, so maybe I missed that bit. So when I
Get them to give you the answer.
Yes, I'm going to actually ask them. The clusters that I noticed that you had put down, it was again categorized into behavioral, it was academic, it was psychiatric. So obviously certain conditions together would also lead to certain issues. So like if let's say there is depression or anxiety being seen, you would see maybe lowered scores in memory, or let's say in terms of psychosocial there may be issues coming up. So there would be overlaps in the clusters as well. So I didn't see that. Like I saw the academic on one side and then all of the others on this side. So I was just wondering, is there those also that are covered?
So that's a good question. What we did, we simply asked 500 or so people to complete the checklist, and we then took the items from item 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. We left out the psychosocial ones. We put it into the computer programs and saw what came out. So we didn't tell the computer programs that we were looking for specific disorders. So it was interesting to us that, mood things as we would group as mood clustered together, the things that we would put together as academic clustered together. There are some exceptions, and that make us think. That's a little bit technical, but given that your question. So for instance, if you look at this group box, overactivity, restlessness, and impulsivity, 3 of those fit very well with ADHD, but there's no inattention for the psychologist. Inattention falls somewhere else. That falls in the neuropsychological group. So that gives us an interesting question. It means that you can have overactivity and impulsivity and not have ADHD in TSC, or you can have, or it may be that it's driven more from a neuropsychological perspective, the attentional issues, rather than from an ADHD perspective. So there are all sorts of mean, this is now quite technical for those of you who are not in the field, but it does give us clues for not just looking at what comes together, but also what doesn't come together. But it was interesting for us that many of these things, so this is a really important box. This, we call it dysregulated behaviors box. That's very clear. It cross-loads, so it talks to other things, but it is its own cluster. And so it means that there's something unique about having these sorts of difficulties in addition to others. A part answer is also, remember that each one of you, as you're ticking the boxes, you or your child might have only this one, or only that one, or only that one, or these two, or so you can have any combination of clusters at any one point in time. This is really just to make it a little bit simpler to say natural clusters. If things come together naturally, it might tell us that there's something about the biology of those things that are shared. There might be something about the genetics that's shared. There might be something about where in the brain it happens that's shared. So that's why it may give us questions to ask, but we haven't asked those questions yet. We really just wanted to get to the, can we find clusters? So that's where we are.